back to the show. So today is Monday, the 11th of May. Yesterday, on Sunday evening, we had a big announcement from the Prime Minister, and it had kind of been trailed for a long time the week before that this was a sort of ending of the lockdown. Of course, it was impossible that anything like that would happen at this stage realistically, but you could probably better describe it as a kind of tweaking of the current situation, which has become our reality for now. And most of these things come in on Wednesday, but effectively the idea is that we'll be able to have what's being described as unlimited exercise. I mean, that sounds like a bit of a commandment rather than a freedom, but effectively it means you can go out and walk as much as you want. So you could go for like an epic walk that lasts the entire day, or a cycle that lasts the entire day, or however many of those you want. Before, you'd only been really allowed to do this for an hour, was the sort of official guidance, but I don't think it was really enforced that strongly. And then a few other things, which is a kind of phase system where some other stuff later on, like shops could reopen within a month, bars and other things could reopen within 2 months, and schools and so on and so forth. I think it is a really interesting, just to look slightly at one little detail of this. And so one of the things that was said was this idea that you can now travel not by public transport, by private transport, i.e. a car, as long as you want to go to a particular place. And now, obviously, UK, it's a pretty small country, it's an island, but there's kind of big kind of road trip culture, and often on the weekends, if the weather's good, people will drive out to some kind of beauty spot. Particularly, people who live in the cities, but also people who live in the countryside. There might be a really cool forest or mountain or beach or other kind of place where people go, and that often National Trust houses, that kind of thing. So there's a big culture of this kind of visiting and road trips, and one of the things that they're effectively announcing was saying, yeah, this is okay. And obviously, in a way, that's really good news for, say, if you run a petrol station, you're going to sell more petrol, right? But also, there's a whole infrastructure. There's something we've covered on this show before, actually. This whole infrastructure of like service stations and cafes and pubs and various other things, which basically anticipate people visiting. And on any given weekend, especially at this time of year, traditionally there'd be loads of people turning up at beachside cafes and roadside pubs and all this kind of thing. But none of that stuff's going to be open. So if you imagine, if you're going to have a whole load of people setting out on these trips, now the weather's terrible this week, but maybe next weekend, setting out and going down to wherever, Lewis, or going to Berlin Gap, or going to wherever the kind of beautiful spot is, wherever you are. But they're going to get there. There's no way you can get a coffee. There's no way you can get lunch. And so yeah, you could bring a thermos flask, you could bring a packed lunch, but also there's no toilets. There's none of the kind of basic facilities which that infrastructure, which actually it's kind of, these are small things, but actually they're kind of like the fabric of what hold all this together. Now, about 3 years ago, I went on one of these trips. I went to Herefordshire and then to across the border to Wales. This is me at Panifan, which is like stunningly beautiful hill in the Brecon Beacons. It's just near Merthyr Tydfil. It's quite near to the major Cardiff, Swansea conurbation. So we walked up this hill. It was so fun, stunningly beautiful. Loads of people up there. Really great weekend, really memorable. And then the next day we went to Rosilly Bay, which is a really beautiful beach near Swansea, and just had one of the most memorable, beautiful trips in a long time. And the reason I'm showing this is I'm in England right now. I'm in London. I even with this restriction being lifted, I can't go to Wales, for example, to visit this hill, because Wales hasn't lifted this restriction, and neither has Northern Ireland, and neither has Scotland. So this is really fascinating, because actually, well, certainly Wales and Scotland are both places where people frequently go to visit the natural beauty. These are major tourism destinations for people from England to go and visit. And because of so these devolved governments, they have power over health measures within their own territory, and effectively they've said we don't think now is the time to ease these restrictions. And I think And I think it's totally understandable. I mean, you look at the numbers, you look at the statistics, and also you look at the responsibilities they have as leaders in those devolved administrations, and you can see why they've made these decisions. And I think I would add an additional point, which is that traditionally, if I were to go out to one of these spots, I would be spending money. I'd be stopping and buying coffees and having lunch and so on and so forth. Um, but now, if I were to go to these places, none of those businesses are open, so I wouldn't really be able to do any of those sort of reciprocal benefits. So I would be coming as a tourist, but I would be benefiting the local economy. But if I were to go there now, sadly, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't really be able to benefit the local economy, and really, I would just be potentially seen as just somebody who's potentially bringing the virus, or potentially clogging up the road, or potentially having an accident and putting an extra drain on the limited local infrastructure. So sadly, those kind of somewhat one of the many reciprocal relationships which sort of bind together city and countryside and the various nations, they're not really existing in the same way, and yet we're sort of restoring this idea that you can visit these places without the other things which do help to bind us together. And I think this is an interesting observation, because obviously before this crisis we had the Brexit crisis, we had all these other things, and there was a feeling that these sort of the bonds and what tie us together as nations, as part of a larger country, were under strain. So it's interesting to see how these things are evolving within this new paradigm. In many ways, we're closer together than ever before, because we're immediately facing the same challenges. But I think we've got to be really careful as we move forward to see to really focus on the things that bring places together, and not really pit one locality against another. It'll be an interesting thing, and I don't have the answers, but it's an interesting thing to think about. We'll be coming back to it more and more. Now, another topic that's really beginning to be discussed more and more is residential space. So along with all these shops that are shut, which potentially in the long term could see a rethink of these commercial premises, we're also having a few reports in the press about people inquiring about moving away from the big cities. Now, as we've discussed previously, there's nothing about big cities which are more at risk of the virus spreading. Density isn't a factor here, although public transport, unfortunately, is, if it's not managed correctly. However, in this country, unfortunately, we don't have a brilliantly, efficiently functioning housing market, and there's a lot of speculation, and there's a lot of overpriced residential in some of our big cities, particularly in the southeast, particularly in London. Now, if you had invested a lot in property there, or borrowed a lot to invest in property there, you could see why somebody might rationally be thinking, well, I've always known this house is overvalued, so I'm thinking, could I be one of the smart ones who gets out earlier on, and one of the people who could maybe swap that for something within the region, and be able to work from home and possibly commute in occasionally where it's necessary. So there's that kind of logic going on. Now, the reports I've read, they've talked about estate agents like Savills reporting this. Savills is like super high end, so that doesn't really represent normal people really. And there were other estate agents saying this, but estate agents, you've got to take what they say with a pinch of salt, because they're salespeople, so they want to sell a particular story. They're going to chase the sales, so they might talk up things and talk up trends which aren't necessarily the full picture. Actually, right now there's no real house sales happening, because the market's effectively on hold, because the government stepped in and put it on hold. Now, I think one of the interesting things is that the government have been saying that they're going to look very closely as we move out of this intense period of the outbreak and move to a more controlled period of the outbreak where we have contact tracing. They're going to look very closely at locality, and so they want really to be able to see if there's an outbreak, say in a particular workplace or a school or a town, and then really move in there with particular measures for that place. Now, I think this is really interesting, because when people think about where they want to live, we could unfortunately move into a kind of scenario where people think more and more about where they are in terms of how many outbreaks are happening and how that limits the kind of freedom that they have in their life. Now, I want to show this really interesting map. This is produced by Sky Online, their news coverage. It's a few days old, but basically this shows London, and it shows the intensity of the outbreak of COVID-19 in different parts of London. Now, I think there's some really interesting stuff in it, and there's some stuff that is actually a bit counterintuitive. So, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 years ago, East London would have been sort of thought of as this kind of undesirable part of London where disease was rife and bugs and slums and all this kind of stuff. Now, on this map, the lighter areas you can see in East London, actually places like Greenwich, places like Tower Hamlets actually have fewer cases. But then again, something a bit more stereotypical. So over here, Richmond, which is, I mean, it's pretty wealthy. It's got that massive park, big houses, expensive place to live. They've also got quite few outbreaks of this recorded incidences of this disease. Where I live in Wandsworth is kind of medium level. Southwark, which is very very much inner London, has more. Lambeth also has more. So we're like Islington, which is I guess a place that's witnessed a lot of gentrification, sort of rapid regeneration in recent decades. That also has quite a few. Places like Brent, which is again very much inner London, very densely populated place, appears to have some of the highest level of incidence, a bit like Southwark. Now the reason I show this map is just because unfortunately it does appear that there are sort of location differences in how these outbreaks are happening, and I think that it would be a really bad outcome if the government were to really kind of carve up our sense of reality by really targeting places in a kind of super localized way. And I think they need to look a bit more cleverer and actually look specifically at things like care homes and hospitals where the disease is sadly proliferating at a horrific rate, and look a bit more closely about why it's being recorded in different places and other things. But I think the plain fact is that maps like this, however crude, possibly could have an impact on things like residential and decisions that people make in the future in a more broader picture that could be short or medium term, but I think it's something which is worth looking at and revisiting. Now, I think the other thing that was certainly worth remarking on in the reports that have come from the government about what's happening next is they really talk about it in economic terms, and they talk about a kind of willingness to get back to work, and they talk about a willingness to get back to consume in terms of pubs and road trips, family outings, that kind of thing. But they really overlook the social dimension, and a lot of our economic growth in recent decades has been around obviously social media, but also what we describe as the experience economy. So things like events and whatever the secret cinema events and the guided tours and all the pubs and other kind of experiences that you can have in a city. Now, a lot of that stuff can't really happen, but also it's sociable. These are things people do with their friends, and it's astonishing how little political attention is being given to the social dimension. Now, it's looking more and more like this situation could go on for months and months and months, if not years. And, there's no real discussion about, how do you make new friends? How do you make new contacts? How do you fulfill your romantic ambitions, flirting and all this sort of stuff? There's no real discussion about this, but this is real human stuff, and this is the sort of purpose that cities have played throughout all time. This is where people meet other people. There's no real discussion of that, and I think that possibly, hopefully, will be something that moves up the political agenda. Again, I don't have the answers. I'm sure some clever app makers and others are thinking about what's going to happen next, but perhaps if you've thought of something, do share it in the comments, and hopefully it's something we can discuss in a future episode. Anyway, for now, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to being with you again discussing some cool and interesting topics. Thanks for listening.